Okay, hello. It's Mark, and this would be Java tutorial number 2, and we're going to try and figure out about what variables are. Now, a bit of clarification I want to do first is about this line right here and what this is doing, and also why we're putting the stuff in the curly braces. Basically, this is what's called our main function, and everything inside of these two curly braces, sort of starting at the line with the actual declaration of the function, everything between those two curly braces is what's going to get run. So if I type out something out here and then don't reference it inside of the main function, it's not going to get run when I click the little run button. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's why I was typing stuff in there. But today we want to work on what's called variables. And so the motive for variables is, let's say, because you can put meaningful names behind them, that's probably one of the biggest ones. Because you can do math in Java, of course. I mean, it's pretty important to be able to do math. So you can like add numbers, you can multiply stuff and do all that stuff, but it doesn't really make sense if you're just looking at the numbers and they don't have labels for them, right? Now, that's why variables, well, one of the reasons why variables are important, and that's when you when you don't give something a variable name and it's just a random constant running around, then we usually would call that a magic number because it's essentially meaningless since no one knows what that number really means. Like if you program something and then someone else looks at your code, they're not going to know what that meant. For example, if I did a little bit of addition here. So don't worry about what I'm typing here to begin with. But let's say we like add two numbers together here and then print out the result. 12. Like the question is, what do these two numbers mean, right? So we need some meaning behind that. And then also I think I could have actually done just this, I believe, and that would give me the result I wanted, but I'll get to what this meant in a second. But you can see how, like, if I just had a bunch of print statements that just had the numbers themselves inside of them and nothing else, that's meaningless, right? We need to put some meaning behind it. And then also another advantage of variables is, since they're they're declared and stuff just once, you only have really one spot that you need to change them versus everywhere in your code where there's like a number 5. So it's a lot easier to fix. Now, there are a couple different types of variables. There is int, there is, at least for the ones that we're going to talk about, there's double, there's Boolean, there is char, and there's string. String we'll try to get to, but it is probably the hardest of these to understand for now. But not saying like they're hard, but it is probably the hardest. So for int is essentially just an integer number, right? If you take it a math class, you know an integer is just any positive or negative whole number, right? That's all it is. So how we declare these variables is we need to first say the variable name, or sorry, the type, then the variable name. So we're going to call it A. We could, though, if we wanted, we could call it like wheel radius. And something important to note is that these variable names, they have to be one word, right? You can't have, now I know it's getting mad at me right now, but you can't do like wheel space radius. Oh, sorry, radius. That's, that just gets kind of funky. So they need to be one word. And then we can either end the line right there and then give this variable a value later, or we can choose to do it right there. But I'm going to show you actually what happens if we try and print out wheel radius right now. We should actually get an error because there's no value for wheel radius right now, I believe. Yep. Wheel radius has not been initialized. So now let's give it a value. Give it like 7. And now, what do you know? We print out 7. So that's basically all that. But we don't need to initialize. That's what giving it a value is called. We don't need to initialize it on the same line. We could actually do it on the line below here. So we could do wheel radius equals 7. And then now run it again, we should get the same result. Look at that. Now, another thing I should mention with these variables is you can sort of, especially in print statements, this is helpful. You can give something to like identify what you're printing out. So right now, so we're just printing out the number 7. That could be confusing, especially once we start printing out a bunch of other things. We want to know what that number 7 means. So let's say in the quotes here, let's type in wheel radius is, and then you do this plus, which does essentially what that does is it concatenates, is what it's called. It concatenates this variable with this string, is what that's called. A string is just a collection of characters. If you remember, I said string is one of the harder ones, but that's all it is. So yeah, now you see it says wheel radius is 7. Okay. Now let's think here. Integers don't really represent everything that we're going to be dealing with, right? I mean, pi definitely isn't an integer. Wheel radius is probably not going to be an integer. It's probably going to be a decimal number. So for that, we have a type called double. Now, doubles can also be... Now I'm going to get rid of this line and just initialize it on the same line now because it's kind of silly. So we're going to give it like 8.7 now. So you see, now it's a decimal number. If we tried to make it an int, though, it's actually going to give us an error because integers cannot be doubles. So let's change it back to double. Okay, and then we run it. Now wheel radius is 8.7. So that's all it is. Now you might wonder, what's the point in using integers if doubles exist? I believe it's because of memory usage and whatnot. An integer doesn't take up as much as a double would, so that's something important, right? Especially for like optimization. You don't want to just make doubles for things that don't need to be doubles. And now next thing here, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. There are some funky stuff that you can try out on your own. Like, I would recommend you try out and see what happens when you try to add a double with an int. I'm not going to do that here, but I recommend that you try and experiment with that and try and print out the result. And so next thing we'll get to here is Booleans. Now, Boolean, this is probably the most simple of all these. Maybe even simpler than the than the integer. So all that a Boolean is just true-false logic. So we're going to declare a Boolean, and I'm going to name it, I'll just name it A. I don't really have a meaningful name to give it right now. And so Booleans can either be true, if I can spell it right, they can either be true or they can be false. Now, I believe Booleans actually do have a default state. It's hard for me to remember. Yes, they do. Oh, maybe they don't. Okay. Maybe I'm wrong. I thought for a second that they have something, they're either true or false by default, but never mind. So this Boolean, all it is it can either be true or it can either be false, and the point behind that is that it's pretty useful in stuff like logic. Once we get to like if statements, you'll probably use these quite a bit, but that's what Booleans are. They're pretty simple. And I can actually, here, let me print out what it is right now. You see it'll print out true, and you put in false. It's good. And then what happens when we try to put a number in here? Doesn't like it because that's not a Boolean. A Boolean has to be true or false. Simple. Okay. And next thing, we'll get onto a character. So we'll make a character, call it A, and then for characters you need to put the actual quote-unquote value inside of these sort of single quotes. I believe you can't use double quotes. Like if I tried to put double quotes then A, it would not be happy with that. So you need to do double quotes and then put in a character. There you go. So all that a character is it's a single character, kind of like on your keyboard. But these guys can act kind of in a bit of funky ways when you work with them, so keep that in mind. Like adding two characters might not work how you would expect. Yeah, there's some funky stuff. I'd recommend you try and mess around with it a little bit. But we can just print this guy out right now, and you'll see that, yep, just like we expected. But characters, what's kind of funny about them is obviously you can make a character a number per se, but this isn't going to act like how our int did, right? Because this is looking at it almost like it's just the letter P or the letter I or the letter M, right? It's not looking at it like it's a number. So our normal sort of idea of addition and subtraction and multiplication doesn't really make sense with this, right? And then next thing we get to is string. Strings are pretty useful, and all that a string is, I think I said it earlier, but it's just a collection of characters. It's what's called a character array. We'll get to what arrays are a little later, but that's what they are. All an array is a collection of something. So in this case, it's a character array. So we could make our string. Now, it's important to note, strings actually include an empty string, right? That is actually something we can print out. That can be an actual value for it. So we could have, how about we literally just make something. We make hello, and then we don't put a space there, and then we put plus A, and then world. Now you see, even though we didn't put spaces in here, this tiny little space should, yep, it puts a space in between them. Look at that. So now let's actually maybe like type in some other stuff in here. Yeah, I'll just put in the. That's all I'll do. And then now I think when we run this, it's going to concatenate them all together. And yeah, hello the world. And then if we put spaces on either end of it, then run it, now it does that. But yeah, that's all I think we should really get to with this stuff right now.